Good evening. On behalf of the Laura and Alvin Siegal Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our fall kickoff event, Isaac, Ishmael and Jesus, Jews, Christians, and Muslims on the Binding of Isaac, featuring Professor Aaron Koller, who will deliver the inaugural Enid and Irv Kushner Lecture. So thank you to the Kushners for your dedication to lifelong learning. We hope your example will inspire others. We also want to thank 929 English for co-sponsoring this event, and we look forward to an ongoing partnership with 929 to bring you learning opportunities related to biblical studies. Before we introduce Aaron, I would like to take a few minutes to preview our fall program, for the first time all virtual. And while we were forced to convert our operations in response to the COVID pandemic, this remote format has allowed us to grow our program, tapping into faculty expertise from around the world and reaching students far and wide. I want to recognize the great dedication of our instructors, many of whom learned to use Zoom in real time with our students. We are pleased this evening to bring greetings and messages from our program partners, instructors, and our staff and faculty at Case Western Reserve University.
Good evening. I'm Chuck Miller, Senior Director of National Development at Case Western Reserve University. I am pleased to welcome you to tonight's program. Siegal Lifelong Learning is a gem in our community, connecting the public to our faculty experts on campus, as well as renowned national and international scholars. And now, thanks to Zoom, we are able to extend our reach to lifelong learners across the country. Like you, my life is enriched by exploring Seigal classes ranging from art, culture, Jewish studies, science, and so much more. Professionally, my work is a privilege, helping adult learners become donors and ultimately philanthropists. I welcome the opportunity to become better acquainted. We can talk about where to mail a $25 check, how to benefit from recent tax laws, meaningful ways to create an impact with your philanthropic plan, and so much more. You can reach me by contacting the Seigal office. Thank you so much for supporting Seigal Lifelong Learning at Case Western Reserve University. Please enjoy tonight's program. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chuck. I know that many of our participants share your enthusiasm for our work, and we are really excited about the upcoming fall term, as the Lifelong Learning Program will be offering over 20 lectures and 60 courses. Please pay attention to our newsletters and website, as we are constantly adding new programs to our schedule. With such a robust program, we can only sample a handful for you tonight, but here's a taste of what we have in store for you this term.
Hi, my name is Jody Maley-Kirk. I'm the Director of Active Learning with the Musical Theater Project.
And I'm Heather Meeker. I'm the Executive Director of the Musical Theater Project, and we are here today to tell you a bit about our course, The Social Conscience of the American Musical.
Yip Harburg is one of our favorite lyricists. You might not recognize his name, but he has written the words to some of our most beloved songs. Over the Rainbow,
Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?
Lydia, the Tattooed Lady,
Old Devil Moon,
How Are Things in Glockamora.
In fact, he wrote so many meaningful pieces about the human condition that he was given the nickname of Broadway's social conscience.
He said, words make you think a thought. Music makes you feel a feeling, but a song makes you feel a thought. Together they stand ready to soothe not only the savage breast, but the stubborn mind. Barriers fall, hostilities melt, and a new idea can find a soft spot even under a hard hat.
Musical theater is a social and cultural touch point with powerful stories, voices, and songs that can move us, teach us, and inspire us. Like Yip, so many songwriters imbue strong social and political viewpoints into their work on issues such as racism, immigration, and poverty.
Our time together will explore ways in which musical theater both reflects the human condition and advocates for human rights. We'll see you in October.
Hi, my name is DARIN CROFT. I'm a professor in the Department of Anatomy at Case Western Reserve University, but my area of research is paleontology, and I'm going to be giving a talk entitled South America's Marvelous Mammals. It's going to take place on Monday, September 14th at noon. Now, you may already be familiar with a lot of the marvelous mammals that live in South America, like monkeys and armadillos and tapirs. But what you may not know is that there are marsupials that also live there. More than 100 species are alive today, and if we go back into the fossil record, they're much, much more diverse and included forms like Thylacosmilus, which essentially was a saber-toothed possum, if you can believe that. So if you'd like to learn more about these and other fascinating mammals, join me for my lecture on September 14th at noon, and we will have some fun talking about mammals. See you then.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan Strong and I teach classes on ancient Egyptian culture as part of the classics faculty at CASE. And this fall, for senior scholars starting in September, I will be teaching a class on one of my favorite topics, which is ancient Egyptian mythology. I taught my first course for Seigal last fall, and I'm really looking forward to seeing some familiar faces and hopefully some new ones to learn all about ancient Egyptian myth. So if you've ever wondered why the Egyptians thought a giant beetle rolled the sun across the sky, or if you want to know more about why Egyptian temples had a porch of drunkenness, hint, Egyptian goddesses had a bit of a drinking problem, or if you're curious as to why Osiris was chopped up into a whole bunch of little pieces by his brother Seth, this is the class for you. So I look forward to seeing many of you this fall.
Hi, I'm Don Rosenberg. Some of you may remember me from my 26 years as a music critic and teacher in Northeast Ohio. I no longer live in Cleveland, but I'll be back virtually to teach a course in the Siegal Lifelong Learning Program starting September 9th titled Intimate and Safe, Music That Could Get Us Out of the House. The goal is to raise our spirits and nourish our souls. So please join me. And in the meanwhile, stay well and safe.
I want to add a special word of thanks to our Siegal Lifelong Learning staff, a truly dedicated team that shifted gears on the fly back in March and have become our own little Zoom support group assisting our students and instructors. We are not printing a fall catalog this year, but of course all our listings are available at case.edu/lifelonglearning. Our staff is here to support you, so please do not hesitate to call or email our offices with any questions you might have about our programs. Now, here are some more previews of the fall.
Hi, I'm Jo Bruce, and I worked for many years in Jewish adult education at the London School of Jewish Studies before a rather unexpected move to the States. 2 years ago, I and my family moved to Cleveland, and I was delighted to discover the vibrant and creative adult education being provided at Siegal Lifelong Learning. Last year, Siegal Lifelong Learning was brave enough to pilot the Hole-in-One program, which uses a curriculum created by the London School of Jewish Studies to cover every single book of the Jewish Bible in a series of mini-courses over the course of the year. Each book, no matter how big or small, how familiar or obscure, gets just 1 2-hour session. This is a task I do not have to accomplish alone. We brought together some of Cleveland's most talented Bible scholars and educators as the instructors for the program. Their background and approaches to the text are as varied as the texts themselves. But what they all bring is a passion to convey the meaning of these ancient texts and their continued relevance for all who study them. The Hole-in-One program was a great success, and I look forward to sharing the breadth and depth of the whole Jewish Bible with you in the Hole-in-One courses this year.
Hi, my name is Michelle Smith-Quarles, and I'm a proud alumni of Case Western Reserve University. I'm a published poet and an adjunct instructor of English at Kent State University and Cuyahoga Community College. I'm very excited to be teaching a course this fall for Siegal Lifelong Learning, centered on the work of 6 very different, very new, very exciting American women poets, including Claudia Rankin, who happened to be my professor when I was a student at Case. The reason that I want to teach this course about these writers and their work is because I believe, like Audre Lorde said, that poetry is the way that we put into language the things that concern us, that trouble us, that anger us, that outrage us the most. It's the way that we figure things out in literature. These 6 women are doing that work, I'm very excited to be exploring that work, very honored to be teaching the course, and I hope that you will join me.
Hi, I'm Robert Watson, history professor at Lynn University in Florida. I've had the pleasure of coming to Cleveland a few times over the last couple of years to lecture for the Seigal program and a case on Israel, topics in history and politics, and my books. It's always a pleasure to come out, and I've always greatly admired what Laura and Alvin Seigal have done with their generous support. And in the capable hands of Brian Amkraut, Cheryl Hirsch, and others, you've created a real first-rate lifelong learning program. So I'm excited to be joining you again in early September, this time to commemorate the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. The story of the 19th Amendment's a great one. It's full of twists and turns and setbacks, perseverance. It's very inspirational. And since I like everyone there at Seigal, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag early. It really did come down to one single vote. I'll also be talking about 100 years of women in politics and sharing the inside scoop from my interviews with a few women who ran for the presidency and my interviews with numerous women in elected office around the country. What they have to say is very interesting, and you don't get this stuff from a textbook. So I look forward to seeing you soon. Until then.
I am SHELLEY ZIMMERMAN, the former Chief of Police of the San Diego Police Department. I am also a former Clevelander who grew up in Beechwood, Ohio. So you may already be asking yourself, how does a kid from Beechwood end up becoming the first woman Chief of Police of the San Diego, California Police Department? I'll give you a little hint of my presentation. It was an Ohio State Buckeye football game that changed my life. And early in my career, I was an undercover cop. So how does an undercover cop end up becoming the Chief of Police? I will tell you also, I'm very proud that as Chief of Police, San Diego was named the safest large city in America. And that didn't happen by luck or accident. It happened by all of us working together. And I do believe that public safety is a shared responsibility. So we're going to discuss the myriad of challenges and opportunities of policing in the 21st century when we're able to virtually see each other again. Until then, please be healthy, please be safe.
Hi everyone, it's great to meet you. I'm Shira Hecht-Koller, Director of Education for 929 English, the Global Tanakh Study Project. We at 929 are thrilled to be a co-sponsor of today's lecture and to be collaborating with the Siegal Lifelong Learning Program in the fall and beyond. 929 is the number of chapters in Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, the formative text of the Jewish heritage, and it's also the name of a cutting-edge project dedicated to creating a global conversation around the Hebrew Bible. 929 English invites learners everywhere to read and study Tanakh one chapter a day, Sunday through Thursday, together with a website with creative readings and pluralistic interpretations, including audio and video by a wide range of writers, artists, rabbis, educators, scholars, students, and more. We invite you to learn along with us and to be part of our dynamic learning community. You can learn with us at our website, 929.org.il, and sign up for our newsletter there. We look forward to many more opportunities to partner and learn together with you. Enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Shira, for the collaboration. We're excited about a great year working together with 929. And thank you all for your patience. A quick reminder before we get started with tonight's program about Zoom etiquette. Tonight's program is being delivered what we call webinar style, which means you can only see and hear our presenters. But we do encourage your participation through the Q&A button on your screen. You can also communicate with one another using the chat function, but we ask you to use the Q&A box for any questions you may have for our speaker. Now, it is my privilege to introduce Professor Aaron Koller. Aaron is Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Yeshiva University, where he is also the chair of the DARIN Department of Jewish Studies. His last book was Esther in Ancient Jewish Thought, and his next is Unbinding Isaac, the Akedah in Jewish Thought. He is also the author of numerous studies in Semitic philology. He has served as a visiting professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and held research fellowships at the Albright Institute for Archaeological Research and the Hartman Institute. Were it not for our pandemic reality, this would have been Aaron's third visit to Cleveland to teach for our program. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Professor Aaron Koller. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here live. I hope the audio is good here. I saw that some people were having some issues there. I have to say that I was very excited about the saber-toothed possum course, and I will likely be signing up. I do want to thank the two teams that brought this all together, from Case Western, Brian, Cheryl Hirsch, and Andrea Krishnik-Rubin, from 929 English, Adam Mintz, and Shira Hecht. And also my thanks to Enid and Irvin Krishner for their investment in deep learning, which can build community in person and virtually as well. Before I get started, I want to reiterate what Brian said. Please use the Q&A for questions. I will try to moderate them once in the middle of the talk and then again at the end. But put them in as you have questions or thoughts, and we'll get to them when time permits. All right, so I am going to start with this. And we will get started. Tonight, I want to think together about the power of stories. Not the ability of stories to tell us what happened, not stories as histories, but stories as narratives, which have the power to shape us as listeners and shape us as storytellers. We tell stories to our children, we tell stories to each other, and we tell stories to ourselves. Stories help us understand our place in the world, how to act, how they help us understand other people and their perspectives. They pass down knowledge and morals, and most importantly, they shape our perspective on the world. Tonight, we'll be talking about one story, a story that is often told, a story that's often told very differently by different people at different times. Many stories morph as they travel. Some stories touch on themes that are so universal that people in different cultures want to tell it. But inevitably, they see it differently, understand it differently, and tell it differently. The story we're discussing is the binding of Isaac, which is told in Genesis 22 in the Jewish and Christian Bibles, and in Surah 37, As-Safatin, in the Quran. The basics of the story in all versions are that the patriarch Abraham understands through a vision that God wants him to sacrifice his son. He prepares to do so, but at the last minute, God intervenes, the son is spared, and instead, Abraham sacrifices a ram. And all stories, and this is a point we'll return to, end by saying that this act will stand as merit for Abraham's descendants in the future. So we're going to start by looking at the text themselves, and then move on to discuss what the story meant to readers of different communities over the millennia. So we're going to start with the biblical story. The biblical story starts sometime afterward. God put Abraham to the test. He said, Abraham, and Abraham answered, here I am. And God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains. I'll show you which one. Now, we should observe that this is the very first time that we hear that one human being loves another in the Hebrew Bible. We don't hear about love between Adam and Eve, between Noah and whatever his wife's name was, between Abraham and Sarah. This is the first time when God says, take your son whom you love. That's the first time we hear of human love. And given what we know is about to happen, this love seems to carry ominous weight. Now, of course, the identity of the son here is explicit. It's Isaac, and I mention that only by way of contrast with some other ways that the story is told that we'll see later on. On the other hand, the location that Abraham is sent to is far from explicit. It's actually quite enigmatic, the land of Moriah. This is not known from anywhere else. This land is never mentioned. Moriah doesn't show up anywhere else. And although many readers have assumed or argued that the mountain of Moriah must be the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, others have said, look, that's a 3-day journey. I checked with Google. It's indeed a 19.5-hour walk from Beersheba to the Temple Mount. But, if Abraham turned around and walked south instead of walking north, he would have wound up in the Sinai Desert. Is it possible that the Akedah, this binding that we're about to read about, takes place not in Jerusalem, but in Sinai? In any event, it's interesting that readers have always assumed that it can't just be a random place. There has to be a sacred space there. Now, we go on in the story. Abraham saddles his donkey, takes 2 attendants, takes his son Isaac, takes the wood, and journeys out. 3 days go by in between verses 3 and 4, and he gets to the place. How he knows it's the place is never quite clear. And Abraham says to his servants, you stay here. I'm going up with the boy. We will go. We will prostrate ourselves. We will return. Now, leaving the attendants behind might suggest that there's an emphasis on a difference between Abraham and Isaac on the one hand and the others on the other hand, or perhaps a need to be alone on the mountain. In any event, that leaves the 2 of them walking by themselves now. Sorry. And we get the only very brief discussion between Abraham and Isaac in the story. We get the following. Abraham takes the wood, puts it on his son Isaac, and he takes the fire and the knife, the ma'achelet, and the 2 of them walk together. Vayelchu shnehem yachdav. And Isaac says to Abraham, his father, he says, Dad. And Abraham says, yes, here I am. And Isaac says, well, there's the fire, there's the wood, but where's the sheep? And Abraham says something that's been enigmatic to readers for the last 2,000, 2,500 years, and one has to assume that if he ever said this to his son, it would have been enigmatic to him as well. God will see the sheep for himself, my son. And then again, the 2 of them walked together. The translators here, this is the JPS translation, translate the 2 phrases at the end of verse 6 and verse 8 slightly differently, walked off, walked on, but actually they're exactly the same. So this very brief dialogue between Abraham and Isaac is framed by the expression, the 2 of them walked together. And that seems ripe for observation and potential meanings. Then suddenly time slows down. I mentioned that it took half a verse to travel 3 days, but now verses 9 and 10, it takes 2 verses to arrive at the altar. I'm sorry, at the place, to build the altar. Abraham lays out the wood. He binds Isaac. He places Isaac on the altar, on top of the wood. He extends his hand to pick up the knife to slaughter his son. And clearly time has slowed down here. We as readers may or may not feel that tension. If not, that's our failing because we know what's about to happen. But the narrator is trying to get us to freeze with anxiety about what's unfolding before us. But then, of course, and I think, visually, this is what we're supposed to be thinking. We're supposed to be watching Abraham with the knife. Isaac is down there. And if we're ethically attuned, I think we focus in on Isaac. This is Caravaggio's painting, which hangs in the Uffizi. And it's been observed that the eye of Isaac here is looking right at us. In other words, asking us to focus on Isaac, who's about to be slaughtered for a vision that he didn't even have. But then, of course, the tension is dissipated when the angel intervenes. And the angel says, don't touch the boy. I know you fear God, Abraham. Abraham then sees a ram caught in the thicket, offers the ram as a sacrifice in place of his son. And the tension, now I can show you the rest of that Caravaggio, is broken by the appearance of this angel. I happen to like this painting by Titian, who almost allows us to see it from Isaac's perspective, looking up at the angel coming from heaven. And we can imagine the aftermath. This is a painting by Jan Levens, a colleague of Rembrandt, which I was fortunate to include on the cover of my own book on this story, which I think shows us the aftermath of the binding. So the angels come, and now Abraham and Isaac can embrace. Isaac can be unbound. Now, the angel then appears again and says, God swears that Abraham's descendants will be numerous and successful. And Abraham returns to his attendants, and they walk together to Beersheba. Erich Auerbach, a German Jewish literary critic who fled Germany during World War II, before World War II, and wound up in Turkey, and there wrote this monumental work, Mimesis, contrasted the way that this story is told with the way that Homer tells stories. Auerbach points out that the narrative that we just read all 19 verses of the narrative, or at least covered them, is incredibly spare. We hear nothing of the land that they walked through, the people they met on the way, where they slept 3 days, what they ate, or even, except for one incredibly brief exchange, what they talked about. Auerbach says that the story is fraught with background, and that the spare storytelling makes us wonder about everything that's behind the stage. I read it differently. I don't think it's fraught with background. I think it simply has no background. When we think about great stories, we think about Homer that Auerbach was interested in. The Iliad is ostensibly a story about the anger of Achilles and the passion of Paris. But what makes the story gripping is not just the characters, but the fact that these characters play out their parts on the canvas of the momentous war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Let's take a more recent example. Hamilton, which has now been democratized and you can watch it for $7.99 a month, subscription to Disney rather than $800,000 or something, whatever the tickets cost, is a story of a remarkable, complex person, Hamilton himself, but in the context of an epoch-altering revolution, a world turned upside down. These stories are great human dramas. They take place within world-altering events. Some stories in the Bible are also of this sort. The life of Moses is also the birth of the nation. The biography of David is also the rise of the monarchy. But not Abraham. Here, there is no background. When did the story take place? Nothing said. What towns did he pass by on his way to the land of Moriah? We're not told. What did the townspeople think of him? Were they at peace? Was there a war? Who controlled the territory? Did he ask for food? Did he have to ask for permission? Did anyone stop him? Was there cultural change? None of this is broached. We hear no background at all. In Hamilton, after a couple of songs, you might recall this, after a couple of songs in the second part about the Hamilton's personal life and the death of Philip, Jefferson says, can we get back to politics? The birth of the country is easier to look at than the suffering of an individual. But in the Akedah, there is nowhere to look but at Abraham and Isaac climbing a mountain alone with a knife in hand. 3 times in the story, 3 times in a very short story, Abraham says, Hineni, I am here, or here I am. Hineni, I am here to God, when God first commands him to offer his son. Hineni to Isaac, when Isaac has a question for him. And Hineni again to the angel, when he hears him calling from heaven. Abraham is nothing but here. He's directly in front of us. There is nothing behind him. And looking so intensely at such an austere character is actually difficult. We wish for more background. Now, in the Quran, the story is actually different. So the context is different, first of all. There is no grand narrative of the patriarchs or a grand narrative of Abraham. Instead, the story shows up in Surah 37, as I mentioned. In Surah 37, Al-Safatin contains a section enumerating righteous people who were rewarded by God. There's a little bit about Noah, Nuh, and then it turns to Abraham. It introduces Abraham. It says that he, as a child, discovered monotheism. He understood that the idols that his father and others were worshiping could not have been, in fact, God or the creators of the universe. As a result, he is tossed into the burning fire you see here in 3797. And that's the scene illustrated here in the 16th century manuscript on the bottom. Abraham being protected supernaturally in the fiery furnace. Now, more to our point, Abraham is then gifted with a child. So we gave him good tidings of a forbearing boy, an Ghulam Halim. Ghulam is a boy. And we, of course, is Allah. In the Quran, God normally speaks in the royal plural, so to speak, in the first person plural. We gave him tidings of a forbearing boy. And as soon as that boy reaches the age of exertion, Abraham says to the boy, look, I've seen in a dream that I sacrifice you. What do you think? So this is worth pausing at. He sees in a dream that he sacrifices him. So he sees a picture. He doesn't see a command. He doesn't see God or an angel talking to him. He sees a picture. And a picture, in this context, is doubly ambiguous. First of all, it's ambiguous in its normative status. So I have a dream. Do I have to work to make this dream come true? Is this dream just a prophecy? It will come true whether or not I try? Is it a nightmare, something to be worried about? So that's one ambiguity. And there's another ambiguity. What exactly did he see? So as will become clear in a minute, what he seems to have seen was himself with his son posed as a sacrifice and he holding a knife to his son's throat. Now, is that the end of the story, the beginning of the story, the middle of the story? He not unreasonably says that he understands that he's supposed to sacrifice his son. So he asks the son, what do I do? And the son says, Father, do as you are commanded. You will find me, inshallah, of the steadfast. So here, the son demonstrates his own loyalty, his own fealty to the covenant, to the relationship with God, by volunteering. And then in the next verse, in 103, when they had both submitted. Now, submitted, the verb here is aslama. That's the verb related to the noun Islam, which means normally submission. And we'll come back to that soon. So they both submitted, they both aslama. And when they had both submitted, we, God, called to him and said, oh, Abraham, you have fulfilled the vision. This is the resolution. The dream never meant that he was supposed to actually sacrifice him, only that he should ready him as a sacrifice. As soon as he's done that, the dream is fulfilled. And then this was the clear trial, and we ransomed him with a great sacrifice, says Allah. So Allah actually provides the ram as a sacrifice, which in the biblical story is not clear. And in fact, that's how we always see it in Islamic art. So the same manuscript that I showed you a few minutes ago for the bottom panel, now look at the top panel. That's Ibrahim and his son about to carry out the sacrifice, but here comes the angel bearing a ram. And again, this is consistently in Islamic art. There's another 16th century illuminated manuscript, stories of the prophets, and here comes the angel bringing the ram down from heaven. And here too is the angel showing Ibrahim the ram as he's about to sacrifice his son. Now, last thing about this story, about this text, before we leave the text and talk about the way people told these stories, is we left for him favorable mention among later generations, and then we gave him good tidings of Isaac, a prophet from among the righteous. So the birth of Isaac is foretold, and literarily at least, that comes after the story of the near sacrifice of his child, although that's not necessarily chronologically so. That was long debated among interpreters. Now, broadly, Jews and Christians have read the story as it's told in Genesis, and Muslims have read the story as it's told in the Quran. But those who have lived together, and this is, of course, the norm for much of history for most places in Europe, the Middle East, have long been cognizant that this is a shared story. So even while people tell their own story, they also know that there is another version that their neighbors tell. Now, of course, shared does not necessarily mean peaceful. You think about a parent who gives one present to 2 or 3 children and says, it's yours to share. That might create tensions. It might even create fights. It might not be a bad idea, though. It also creates opportunities for cooperation if it goes well. So what we're going to do in the rest of our time is to look at a few ways in which reading communities have informed each other. Christians and Jews, Jews and Muslims, so on. So I'm actually going to pause here and see what's come up in the questions. If anyone has a question that they want to put in right now, it's a good time. And let me just see if there's anything that we can address now before we move on. Great. Okay, so there's actually a number of really intelligent and interesting questions. A couple of people asked about the age of Isaac. This is a question that can't be answered with any certainty from the biblical narrative at all. In the Quran, as we saw, it says that the son had reached the age of exertion, which makes it sound like he's a sort of young adolescent, old enough to actually work on his own. In the Jewish textual tradition, we think about Midrash, or we think about the Aramaic translations of the Bible. We'll actually see a couple of these texts in a bit. In the Jewish textual tradition, he's said to be an adult, 25, 36, 37, but a real adult. But in the artistic tradition, among at least what we have in synagogue art, as well as in early Christian art, he's always depicted as a young child. Obviously, numbers aren't given there, but he's recognizably a child. So that's actually a great question. It matters. It actually does matter, and it's a great example of all the details that are just not in the narrative. It matters a lot because if you imagine Abraham taking his 6-year-old up the mountain, it's sort of easy to understand that when he says, "Oh, God will see the sheep for himself," that's just a way of sort of saying something that's not really saying anything, and sort of letting the kid think that there was an answer and not worry too much. But if the son is 37, then an enigmatic answer is going to be understood as enigmatic by the child. And the same midrashim, the same rabbinic texts that think that Isaac is an adult, also understand that at that point, Isaac understands that he is the sacrifice. So it really does matter for all sorts of reasons. But I don't have a conclusive answer to that question. I mean, my reading of the story takes him to be like a sort of adolescent, 12, 13, 14, something like that. But I wouldn't pretend that that's certain at all. All right, let's see what else. So Sarah, right? So a few people mentioned the absence of Sarah and then the death of Sarah. So this is actually a really, I think, profound point. I'll just mention quickly that that ancient readers also noticed the absence of Sarah. As someone mentioned, I'm sorry, I don't remember who. Marcia and Bruce Alter mentioned that Sarah died soon after. So in fact, literarily, she dies in the very next chapter. This is chapter 22 in Genesis. Chapter 23 begins with the death of Sarah. There's a little paragraph in between. But the Jewish tradition connects those. But the texts that I found actually most interesting are Syriac Christian texts, poems actually, from 5th, 6th, 7th century CE, of course, which imagine dialogues between Abraham and Sarah before Abraham sets out for the mountain with Isaac. And there's a whole bunch of these Syriac texts. Syriac is just a dialect of Aramaic that was used by the Eastern Church in late antiquity. And in some of these poems, Sarah pleads with Abraham to please not go. And she says, "Look, Abraham, you don't understand how painful it was for me to bear Isaac. Emotionally painful and physically painful. You didn't experience the same pain. Please don't do this to me." In other texts, Sarah is Abraham's peer in terms of faith. I mean, she doesn't hesitate in terms of fulfilling the will of God. She wants to participate, though, with him. She wants to go also. She's like, "Why am I being left out here?" So I'm not going to try to answer that question. I'll just say that the absence of Sarah has been long noticed and is really ripe for reading the story in that light. I think it's actually really important to think about what would it have meant if Sarah were in the story. I have some thoughts on that, but maybe at the end if we have time. Okay, so a few people noticed, and this is, I avoided it, but it's certainly noticed that the son in the Quran is not named. So I think at this point, really, that would be the most important thing for me to say. The son simply doesn't have a name. The early Muslim interpreters were divided on the identity of the son. I say majority, it doesn't really matter if we count up number of interpreters, but many early interpreters in the 9th, 10th, even 11th, 12th centuries of the Common Era argue that the son who is almost sacrificed was Isaac. One of the most influential interpreters of the Quran, Tabari, argues that it must have been Isaac, and he has a somewhat detailed argument for that position. By the time you get to about the 14th century CE, Muslim interpreters have concluded that in fact the son in the story was Ishmael. That wasn't a new view, that was one of the views earlier on, but by the 14th century that becomes a consensus view. And my understanding is that's still the consensus view among Muslims. But in the Quran itself, it's actually never stated. So that's an important thing to notice. Okay. There's a lot of other wise and insightful things said here, but I'm going to put them aside. If we have time at the end, we'll come back to them. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our presentation. Here we go. Now, time permitting, I want to look at 5 different ways in which different reading traditions, Jews, Christian, Muslims, influence each other. So we're going to do some of these rather quickly and some of them in a little bit more detail. I want to start about 2,200 years ago, back with a Jewish book called Jubilees. It's a book that's not part of the Jewish Bible or any of the European or Middle Eastern Christian Bibles, but it was part of the Ethiopian church already back in antiquity, so it's been preserved in Ethiopic, in classical Ethiopic. Now we know parts of it in the original Hebrew as well, because sections were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Judean desert. And you have here a recent translation, which is accessible and really wonderful by a major scholar, James Vanderkam, who has worked long on this text. In chapter 17 in Jubilees, the story of the Akedah, of the binding, is found. And we're told the following: during the 7th week, in the first year, during the first month, on the 12th of this month, in this Jubilee, in other words, the year 2003, I suppose I should say that Jubilee is a cycle of 50 years, and the book has that name because all dates are given by the Jubilee cycle. So every date is given in which Jubilee cycle, and then which sabbatical cycle, which year in the sabbatical cycle, which month, which day. There were voices in heaven regarding Abraham, that he was faithful in everything that he told them, the Lord loved him, and that every difficulty he was faithful. And then Prince Mastema came and said before God, Abraham does indeed love his son Isaac and finds him more pleasing than anyone else. Tell him to offer him, Isaac, as a sacrifice on an altar. Then you'll see whether he performs this order, and we'll know whether he's faithful in everything through which you test him. So the point about Mastema, who's clearly like a Satan-like figure, we'll come back to him later on. But right now, let's actually look at something that's easy to gloss over, the date. When does this take place? It takes place in the first month, on the 12th of the month. Now, the first month in biblical language is Nisan, in the spring, the first month of the biblical calendar. At the end of the story, it turns out that this date is really important, because at the end of the story we read, then Abraham went to his servants, they set out and went together to Beersheba. Abraham lived at the well of the oath. He used to celebrate this festival joyfully for 7 days during all the years. He named it the Festival of the Lord in accord with the 7 days during which he went and returned safely. You remember that it took 3 days to get there, so 3 days to get there, 1 day being there, 3 days to get back. There's our 7 days. This is the way it's ordained, written on the heavenly tablets regarding Israel and his descendants. They have to celebrate this festival for 7 days with festal happiness. Now, since this story took place in Nisan, this 7-day festival can only be Passover. The Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is here linked to Passover, and that makes Isaac something like a prefiguration of the Paschal lamb. But of course, that makes such good sense when we think about it. At the Exodus, the firstborns of the Egyptians were killed. The firstborns of the Israelites were spared. This sparing of the firstborn from near death is the theme that links the Akedah in Genesis with the Exodus and with the night of Passover. Now, I want to emphasize that this book, Jubilees, is a Jewish book, roughly 200 years before the crucifixion of Jesus. Early Christians saw Isaac as prefiguring Jesus in many ways, and this is really worth considering. Both the birth of Isaac and the birth of Jesus were miraculous births, announced by 3 visitors. Isaac's birth is preceded in the Bible not by a notice that Abraham slept with Sarah, as we often have in the Bible, but with the Lord visited Sarah. Adonai pakadet Sarah, opening the possibility that, at least metaphorically, God, rather than Abraham, was Isaac's father. Both Jesus and Isaac are, of course, the one and only son of their fathers. While Isaac is the first person loved in the Bible, John 3:16, which pops up at every baseball game, tells us that Jesus was sacrificed because of God's great love for the world. In both stories, the son carries the wood or the cross to the place of his own sacrifice. Both Jesus and Isaac are dead, Jesus literally, Isaac figuratively, for 3 days, and then both are resurrected. So it's really no surprise then that Jesus too is seen as a Paschal lamb, as was Isaac. The Gospel of John reports that Jesus' execution was the day before Passover, namely the 14th of Nisan. The Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, seem to place on the 15th, but those are nuances that are almost beside the point for our purposes. The real point is clear. Paul says it explicitly in 1 Corinthians. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast that you might be a new unleavened batch, as you really are, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Now, when John says that the Roman soldiers broke the legs of the other men who had been crucified with Jesus, but they did not break Jesus' leg, John comments that this happens that the scripture would be fulfilled. Quote, not one of his bones will be broken. Now, that's not a prophecy about the Messiah. That is a legal text about the Paschal sacrifice, that it must be whole with no broken bones. And so Jesus, the ultimate Paschal lamb, has to be unbroken as well. The explicit equation of Jesus on the cross with Isaac on the altar is not found in the New Testament. It's found in the Church Fathers, and this is from the Epistle of Barnabas around the year 100 CE. But the point is that the ground for this reading, for understanding Jesus as a Paschal lamb and Jesus as Isaac, was prepared before Jesus walked on earth, because Jews had long associated Isaac and the Akedah with the Passover. Early Christians simply took that equation, Isaac equals the Paschal lamb, and turned it into a trinomial. Isaac equals Jesus equals the Paschal lamb. Now, it might not be surprising that the Jews quickly dropped this association. While Jubilees had stated that the Akedah took place on Passover, later Jewish tradition associates it rather with the other great festival time of the year, the fall festival of Rosh Hashanah, the New Year. And in synagogues in 2 weeks, Jews will read the story of the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, as the Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah, and the shofar, the ram's horn, will be said to conjure up God's memory of this event. In other words, in the face of the Christian equation of Isaac with Jesus and the Akedah, Jews went in a very different direction altogether. Now I want to look at a case where Jewish readings and Muslim readings agree, and that's on the role of the son. They walked together. So as we saw in the Quran, the son is a full willing participant in the sacrifice. He said, you will find me, inshallah, if Allah wills, of the steadfast. In the biblical text, the role of the son is far more enigmatic. One could have understood that Isaac is just a prop in Abraham's play. But Jewish interpreters normally saw Isaac as much more than that. Here's one midrash from the Tanhuma. The two of them walked together, one to slaughter, one to be slaughtered. Rabbi Abin Halevi, son of Rabbi, said, as they were walking, Satan appeared next to Isaac and said, hey, wretched one, son of a wretched woman, how often did your mother fast that you would be born? And now this old man has gone out of his mind in his old age. He's going to slaughter you. Isaac turned to his father and said, look what this man's saying to me. And Abraham said, he's trying to confuse you, but the Holy One will not confuse us. As it says, God will see the lamb for a burnt offering. And even so, the two of them walked together. How old was Isaac? 37 years. Now, at this point, it's not clear whether Isaac knows what's happening or not. But now look what happens. They came to the place. When he came to slaughter him, Isaac said to his father, bind me hand and foot, because the soul is rebellious. I want to be a willing participant here. I want to be sacrificed. But it's likely that when the knife appears, I'll jerk around and I'll be disqualified as a sacrifice if the cut isn't clean. So please, Abba, so that the blemish won't be inflicted on me. It's a heart-wrenching midrash. For our purposes, the important thing is that Isaac is a absolutely full willing participant here, actually pointing out to his father that he needs to tie him well. Which is interesting because, of course, if he's a willing participant, why does he have to be tied? But the midrash says he has to be tied because no matter how willing a person is, self-preservation is a powerful force. And when the knife comes out, just jerking around, just moving is inevitable. So please, Abba, he doesn't want to be an invalid sacrifice. He wants to be a pure, acceptable sacrifice. Now, on the linguistic level, a number of texts in both Hebrew and Aramaic say that Isaac and Abraham made their hearts complete in fulfillment of the divine command. Targum, the Aramaic translation says, "Va'azalu trehon kechada b'liba shalama." The two of them walked as one with their complete heart. Menachem Kister, an Israeli scholar, pointed out that this word, shalem, is the same as the Arabic word aslama in the Quran. So the reading reflected in the Quran that emphasizes the willing participation of the son is a reading shared by Jews at the time as well. Now, I want to look at a slightly more complicated case. Christian and Jewish readers who think about the story as a story of martyrdom. Now, strikingly, the Jewish Bible contains exactly 0 cases of martyrdom. There are a few stories of people willing to die for their religion or for their faith, Daniel and the lion's den, for example, but such people in the Bible are miraculously saved in the Hebrew Bible. The first Jewish literary martyrs are from the books of Maccabees and the story of Hanukkah. But these martyrs, we might say, are defensive martyrs. They died rather than violate something. The death is not in and of itself a positive. In early Christianity, martyrdom unfortunately looms very large. Now, of course, this takes its theological cue from the crucifixion itself. Jesus' death is not just a way of avoiding something else. It is the moment that gives meaning not only to Jesus' life, but to literally all of human existence. In fact, the entire relationship between God and the world hinges on Jesus dying on the cross. Now, early Christians tragically had plenty of opportunities to live out the death of Jesus. With Christianity being illegal in the Roman Empire, a Christian tempted death by declaring her faith, and many paid for their faith with their lives. Now, there's a midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which says nonchalantly, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac. So in other words, Isaac is going to carry this wood up the mountain, like one who carries his own cross on his shoulder. Now, for us, that inevitably sounds like Jesus. But for ancient Jews and Christians, crucifixion was a common method of execution used by Romans. Now, there's something paradoxical and really profound about martyrdom. The martyr may die, but in doing so, she strengthens her community. The noble Roman Perpetua may have been killed for her faith, but that act will be commemorated by those in her community because her death provides them with the motivation to keep faith strong, to keep on living for their faith. The logic seems to be as follows. If something is very important, it's worth sacrificing for. Only the most important things are worth dying for. And since Perpetua died for Christianity, Christianity must be a most important thing. Now, this gives rise, somewhat surprisingly, I think, to what I call martyr envy. The Jews in antiquity did not suffer many martyrs for their faith because Judaism wasn't illegal in the Roman Empire. This might have been fortunate for individual Jews who didn't die, but it's actually unfortunate for Judaism, which was deprived of the evidence that Christianity had of its own worth. And that, I think, is what the following midrash is addressing. This is a story that introduces the Akedah. In other words, the way a story is introduced makes all the difference in what it means. So let's listen to this. This is the prologue, the prequel, so to speak, of Genesis 22. Now imagine Ishmael in the story as early Christians and Isaac as the Jews. We have the following conversation. After these words, after the argument of Isaac and Ishmael, Ishmael said, "It would be fitting for me to be father's heir. I am the firstborn son." And Isaac replied, It would be fitting for me to be father's heir. My mother is his actual wife. You are the son of Hagar, my mother's maidservant. Ishmael answers, okay, fine, let's put genealogy aside. Let's focus on merit, though. I'm more deserving than you. I was circumcised at the age of 13. If I had wanted to, I could have protested. I didn't have to submit to that. You were circumcised when you were 8 days old. If you knew what was happening, you might not have submitted at all. And Isaac concedes that that's true. He has never demonstrated his own faith, his own loyalty to the covenant. But he says, but that's only in practice. In potential, I'm there. Now I'm 36 years old. And if the Holy One, blessed be he, asked me for all of my limbs, I would not hesitate. So immediately, God tested. Now, Isaac laments the fact that he's never been asked to sacrifice himself, so God gives him the chance. The story of the binding of Isaac with this frame becomes a Jewish answer to Christian martyrdom narratives. We're no less faithful, only somewhat more fortunate. If we were called upon to make the ultimate sacrifice, we stand ready. Now, unfortunately, later centuries Jews had plenty of opportunities to prove this point. I'll mention just quickly the heart-wrenching events of 1096, when Christian Europeans, on their crusade to wrest the Holy Land from the Muslims, took the opportunity to attack Jewish communities in Germany. When this did occur, Jews sometimes opted to die rather than be captured by Christians, and even more terribly, sometimes opted to kill their children rather than allow their children to be captured by Christians. So we read this in a contemporary Jewish chronicle, just from a couple of decades later. There was a young man named Rab Meshulam, son of Rabbi Isaac. He called out in a loud voice to all those standing there, and to Mrs. Tzipporah, his wife. Listen to me, old and young, this son, whom God gave to me, whom Tzipporah, my wife, bore in her old age, whose name is Isaac, I will now offer him as a sacrifice, just as our father Abraham did with his son Isaac. And Tzipporah, when we talked about Sarah earlier, Tzipporah answered, Lord, wait a bit. Don't stretch out your hand against the lad whom I've raised in marriage. That's literally a quote from Genesis 22, whom I bore in my old age. Slaughter me first. Let me not see the death of a child. But her husband answered and said, I will not wait even a second. The one who gave him to us should now take him back to his portion, give him a seat in the lap of our father Abraham. He bound his son, took the knife in his hand to slaughter his son, made the blessing on ritual slaughter, and slaughtered the lad. And then took his screaming wife. The two of them went outside together, and they were immediately killed by the Crusaders. Now, if the Akedah provides a language for the narrative, it also provides the language for theological outrage at these events. And this is the narrator, the chronicler speaking. Ask and see, has there ever been an Akedah like this in all the generations since Adam? Were there ever 1,100 Akedot on one day, each one like the sacrifice of Isaac, son of Abraham? For the one bound on Mount Moriah, the world shook. As it says, behold, the angels cried out and the skies darkened. Why did the skies not darken when on one day 1,100 holy souls, children, babies who never sinned, did anything wrong, and the clear souls of the poor were killed and slaughtered? So tragically, for both Jews and Christians, the Akedah taught the value of martyrdom, the value of sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice for one's faith. And as we mentioned, this is the usual meaning of Islam as well. So when Ibrahim and his son Aslama submit, they also demonstrate their willingness to submit to divine commands. I want to turn, we have two examples that I'm going to work this one very quickly and then the second one for a few minutes. In the Quran, as we saw, the actual command is ambiguous. Ibrahim sees a vision, but it's unclear what he's supposed to do with this vision. Now that ambiguity is found in rabbinic texts as well, but defensively. We have, for example, this midrash, which imagines Abraham at the end of the Akedah, when the angel appears and says, don't slaughter him. Abraham finally explodes. He says, what's going on with you, God? Yesterday you said Isaac would be my heir. Then you said slaughter him. Now you say don't slaughter him. And God says, Abraham, I'm not going to desecrate my covenant. I'll uphold my covenant with Isaac. When I said take your son, there was no contradiction. I didn't actually say slaughter him. I said bring him up. Ha'alehu. Bring him up, take him down. Now I have to say, this midrash, as a reading of the biblical text, to me at least, seems entirely implausible. And we can talk more about why, but it seems like a very defensive move on the midrash's part, just to sort of fend off the inconsistency of God. In the Quran, though, that ambiguity is built into the narrative. He saw himself with a knife to his son's throat, and he infers that he's supposed to sacrifice him. But once he actually puts a knife to the throat, Allah says, that's it. You fulfilled the dream. Now, in the Middle Ages, the challenge that we just saw in the Midrash that Abraham lobs at God, the inconsistency of God, is actually lobbed at the biblical story by Muslims. Some Muslims look at the story and say, well, this is insane. God changes his mind in this text. He says, sacrifice Isaac, don't sacrifice Isaac. That's not God. God is never changing. So scholars such as Ibn Hazm argue that this shows that the text of the Bible as the Jews have it is corrupt. They were not actually reliable caretakers of the text of the Torah. This idea is known as tahrif, the falsification of the Bible on the part of the Jews. And Jews who were familiar with the Quran and familiar with Muslim polemics fell back on this midrash as a defense against this accusation. God didn't change his mind, they argue. He never said to sacrifice Isaac in the first place. Saadia Gaon, for example, who lives in 10th century Baghdad, says that Abraham didn't make a mistake. The command was originally ambiguous. Now, Saadia knows the Quran. He actually cites it occasionally. And I wonder whether his reading here is inspired by knowledge of this other version of the story. In other words, he might, in part, read the Bible in light of the Quran and thus sidestep the Muslim accusation of an inconsistent God in Genesis. Now, the last point that I'm going to mention is the values of the merit of the story. Everyone sees the story as one where the mind-boggling faith and piety of Abraham and Isaac create everlasting merit for their descendants. So here's one passage from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud in Rosh Hashanah. Rabbi Abahu says, a 3rd century Palestinian sage, why do we blow a ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah? The Holy One said, blow a ram's horn before me, so that I will recall for you the Akedah of Isaac, son of Abraham, and I'll consider it as if you have sacrificed yourselves to me. Now, in Christian thought, of course, the full merit of the binding only comes through its fulfillment in the crucifixion. Abraham deserves credit for being willing to sacrifice his only child, although there's actually a debate of sorts within the New Testament whether Abraham's credit comes from the faith that he exemplified or the actions that he performed, which of course is a really profound question about whether faith or acts is most important. But how much more merit is accrued when God actually sacrificed his only child? But he did so, as John said, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And you'll recall that the Quran too concludes the story. Allah left for him favorable mention among later generations. Now, as readers of these stories, as we mentioned a while ago, we suffer actually from knowing the end before we start. It's hard to appreciate the dramatic tension. But the text wants us to do exactly that. And as we saw, the narrator slows down dramatically in the biblical text when it gets to the part of Abraham actually readying the sacrifice. Now, readers have been attuned to this, and I want to end with 2 texts, one ancient, one modern, which bring this tension home. The tension is not just about the life of Isaac, you see. That's also important, but it's also about the covenant and the covenantal community that's meant to be created in Genesis. Now, we saw that in Jubilees, the Akedah was instigated by this Satan-like character called Mastema. That same character plays the same role in another text, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which has the lovely name 4Q225, as it actually looks like. And there is another element as well. Some of the parts of the text are missing, but it's likely that it reads at the dramatic point where Abraham is about to slaughter Isaac, that the angels of Mastema, in other words, the evil angels who are aligned against all that's good in the world, they were rejoicing as they watched Abraham ready the knife, because they said, now he's finished. If Abraham withholds his son, he'll be found to be false. And if not, he'll be found faithful, but his son will die. In other words, there's no way out at this point. The covenant between God and Abraham is dead. Either it dies with Isaac on the altar, or it dies when Abraham refuses God's command. That's the tension as Abraham raises his knife. Elie Wiesel suggests, in I think similar ways, that this was actually a double test. In the same way that God was testing Abraham, Abraham was testing God. Listen to this, because I think it's brilliant. Abraham knew that God had already promised that he would have descendants, a great nation. Abraham also knew that God rejected murder, rejected child sacrifice. So Abraham said, all right, God, let's see how far you'll go with this. Let's play a game of chicken. You dare me to sacrifice my son? I dare you to allow it to happen. And Abraham wins the game. He forces God to back down, to step in at the last moment and stop the knife. What does the winner get? He gets an oath. Abraham gets God to swear by his own name that Abraham's descendants will thrive. And in that moment, Abraham has God on the altar. He has God bound up, and he extracts from him an oath. And one midrash, our last text for tonight, puts these words into his mouth at that point. Eternal Master, may it be your will, the Lord our God, that at the time when the children of Isaac do transgressions and bad deeds, that this very Akedah be remembered for them, and that you be filled with mercy on them. Now, we have followed this story with the twists and turns through three great religious traditions, three different holy scriptures. Not one of them has lived in a vacuum. The different streams of tradition have run into each other, fed each other, repelled each other, and also enriched each other. Like coexistence in the real world, the coexistence of ideas does not mean that we'll all love each other and live happily ever after. But we're always made richer, deeper, and more complex by encountering other people, hopefully on Zoom as well. And the same is true for ideas and stories. So I'll end just with the hope that our study together tonight has both enriched the story for us all and enriched our very selves. All right, so I'm going to come back to these questions. Okay, so a number of people, there's just a clarification question. When I said that for 3 days Isaac was dead, obviously I meant figuratively. His sentence to be killed was issued, and then he walked for 3 days. So he is, I would call him, I think legitimately, among the walking dead. And it's someone who's already been condemned to death. Okay, so there's a number of questions that would take us a little bit too far afield. But I should say just one clarification, because a number of people mentioned people who die in the Bible. So there are lots of people who die in the Bible, including 4 cases of suicide in the Bible. I wouldn't call them martyrs. They don't die for their faith. They die for other causes. But I guess that's we could discuss or debate that at a later point in a little bit more detail. So it's true. So a number of other people pointed out that there are martyrdom stories in rabbinic literature. So that's a great point. And maybe I should have at least mentioned them. Rabbi Akiva is by far the most important one. I will just throw out there, and this is going to be a sort of provocative thing to say, but I'll throw out there that I find it compelling that the story of the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva is actually influenced by the story of the martyrdom of Jesus. But that's something that's obviously a bigger topic. But the famous narrative that is often recited on Yom Kippur of the 10 martyrs, Asara Harugei Malchut, the 10 martyrs in the Roman Empire. So I'll just mention that those 10 martyrs come from the span of like 400 years. So it's fairly remarkable that in 400 years, the Midrash is able to come up with 10 martyrs. I'm not arguing that that's the only people who died at the hands of the Romans. That's obviously not true. Hadrian was furious after Bar Kokhba, for example, and lots of people died then. But the martyrdom as a literary genre, as a religious value, looms far larger in early Christianity than it does in rabbinic Judaism. Okay. I'm sorry. Some of these questions are great. They're just a little lengthy. Right. So a couple of excellent questions about child sacrifice in the ancient world. This is not a plug for my book, but in the book that I wrote about the story, which is called Unbinding Isaac, I do have a chapter there about child sacrifice, which was real. I mean, this is it's actually horrifying to read about, but we have tens of thousands of graves of children who were sacrificed in the sort of triangle in the Mediterranean where the Phoenicians set up settlements. Carthage is the biggest one. And I agree with you. So I don't think this is directly relevant to anything we talked about this evening, but I think it's absolutely central to thinking about the biblical story that child sacrifice for Abraham or for anyone in biblical Israel would not have come as this like totally shock idea, like how could God command such a thing? They had neighbors who did it ostensibly at the behest of God. And actually in the Bible, it's entirely clear that there were people in Israel who offered their children as sacrifices, arguing that that's what the God of Israel wanted. There's the prophets condemn it a lot. There's all sorts of passages in the Torah, in the Pentateuch, that could be read in that way. So there's a lot of evidence that child sacrifice maybe shocks us more in Genesis 22 than it would have shocked the ancient Israelites. And I think we miss the point of the story if we are just sort of horrified by this idea. Not that it was ever a simple idea, but it was not novel in this story. Okay, so yeah, interesting. A few people mentioned things about the traditions, which I guess have become pretty well known, that Isaac actually died on the altar. So this is a fascinating idea that is most famously and most importantly traced in a book. It was originally an article and then became a book by Shalom Spiegel called something. I'm trying to remember what it's called in English. In Hebrew, it's called Me'agodot HaAkedah, The Last Trial. It's called The Last Trial, and he wrote this article, which became a book, in an attempt to explain a medieval Jewish poem, which actually explicitly says that Abraham slaughtered Isaac. Isaac was then revived miraculously, and Abraham wanted to then slaughter him again. And in order to explain this poem, Spiegel amasses a huge amount of textual tradition, Jewish and Christian, that argue that in fact Isaac did die on the altar. Obviously, that's far-fetched in the biblical context, but it's there. It's there already in early texts. So I think that's a case where the Jewish and Christian traditions absolutely have to be read together because they're feeding off each other. Okay. Okay, and a couple of people mentioned modern resonances of the Akedah. One person mentioned, I'm sorry, I have to describe Irv Krishner. Oh, Irv Krishner. Wilfred Owen's poem, The Parable of the Old Man and the Young, which is sort of a terrible poem. Wilfred Owen's a British poet who died in the trenches in 1918, fighting in World War I, writes a poem where he retells the story of the Akedah, essentially. But at the end of the poem, at the end of the story, he ends it with the angel who says, oh, don't offer the lad. I don't remember exactly where. Don't offer the lad. Here's a ram instead. But then the last two lines in Owen's poem are, but the old man would not do so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. And this is I think a really important point to just put out there when thinking about this story. It is a story that actually asks a parent to sacrifice a child for the parent's own piety. And that is a tough idea that lots of children have resented. In fact, lots of parents have resented as well. There's a whole literature in modern Israel, for example, of children who essentially say, like, I don't want to be Isaac anymore. Like, I don't want to go to battle for the ideals of my parents. Okay. All right. So yeah, I'm just going to close with a response to a few of the comments at the end there, which are which asked about permanent damage to Isaac or to Abraham or to the relationships. And I think that's a really important point. Saying that Abraham passed the test, which is explicit in the biblical text and even more explicit in the Quran, doesn't mean that that all is well and good at the end of the story. It's pretty clear, I think, in the biblical text that Abraham pays a very steep price for what happens in Genesis 22. And that's been noticed by a lot of people, that Abraham and Isaac never speak again. Also true that, as a number of you mentioned, Sarah's death in the next chapter, it says that Sarah died, and then it says that Abraham came to Hebron to mourn for her and to lament her. And commentators say, like, well, why do you have to come? Like, where was he? And I think one plausible interpretation is that he also didn't live with Sarah anymore at that point. His relationship with his entire family may plausibly have been shattered by the binding of Isaac. So I don't want to say that as saying that he failed the test. It may be that he was pious enough to pass the test, but that piety itself wrecked his interpersonal family relationships. Whether there's another way that he could have gone about it is a really interesting question. He doesn't, for example, pray. He doesn't try to intercede for the life of his son. And that's something that a lot of commentators have asked, like, why not? Maybe he should have. So I'll have to end it there. Thank you all so much for your attention, and especially for your comments, questions, and contributions. I feel like I've been enriched by this.
Aaron, thank you so much. I know you've been busy giving your presentation and might not have been paying attention to all of the chatter on the chat, which was so positive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and bringing in multiple traditions, which is not something we often get the chance to do with respect to these ancient texts. So, I appreciate your, gracious approach to accepting the invitation. I hope those of you that are listening around the country, perhaps around the world, enjoyed this taste of what we have in store for you for the rest of the academic year, particularly with respect to our ongoing collaboration with 929 English. And please, if any of you have questions about additional programs, you can either email us directly, lifelonglearning@case.edu, send us an email, call our office 216-368-2090, and you will undoubtedly be hearing and getting information from us on upcoming programs, but please don't hesitate to let us know what we can do a little bit better. So thank you all again. Have a great night, and thanks, Aaron, for your work.